She said, "The guest room's for the baby. You'll be more comfortable on the couch anyway." In the house I bought. I remember the way she said it, light, cheerful, almost apologetic, like she was offering me the last slice of pie she didn't really want me to have. The baby was upstairs then, asleep in a nursery, painted in what she called organic cream. And I was standing in the hallway holding my small overnight bag, the one I'd used for decades whenever I visited anyone I loved. The bag looked ridiculous in that space, too small, too worn, too brown for all that glass and white and steel. I had packed carefully, folding 2 nightgowns, my hairbrush, a photo of my husband, and a tin of lemon shortbread I'd baked that morning, because I still believed that bringing something homemade was a gesture that meant something. I didn't know that in this house. Such gestures only meant you were out of touch. I didn't argue with her. I never did. I just nodded and smiled, because that's what women my age were taught to do when the younger ones start speaking slowly to us, as if our hearing, not their manners, were the problem. I'm 78 years old, and I live alone now, in a small apartment with cracked window panes and the smell of someone else's cooking in the hallway. It isn't fancy, but it's mine, every inch of it mine, and when I close the door at night, no one tells me where I can or cannot sleep. But that night, standing in the house I'd helped my son buy, I was still a woman who thought silence was the price of love. Ben was pouring himself a glass of wine in the kitchen, pretending not to hear. He always did that, stayed quiet when the cruelty was small enough to disguise as politeness. His wife, Lauren, had a way of speaking that could slice through your dignity without ever raising her voice. The couch was long and sleek, the kind you buy not to sit on, but to be seen sitting on. It faced a television the size of a window, and when I laid my hand on one of the cushions, the leather was cold, indifferent. I told her it would be fine. She smiled, relieved, as if I had solved a problem she didn't want to admit she had created. They both went upstairs soon after, carrying the monitor and the half-empty bottle of wine. I stayed in the living room, listening to their voices fading into the ceiling. I could hear water running in the bathroom, then the creak of the nursery door. I knew every sound of that house, though I'd never lived there. I'd paid for half of it, the down payment, the closing costs, the first year of insurance, because Ben's credit had been just shy of approval, and I couldn't bear the idea of him losing his chance at a family home. I told myself it was my gift to them, but I had also imagined it as a place where I might always be welcome, where there would be a room for me, not out of obligation, but out of belonging. I used to imagine holidays there, laughter echoing down the hallways, my hands busy in the kitchen, the smell of roast chicken and apple pie filling the rooms. I had even thought of buying a little rocking chair for the porch, but dreams like that don't survive contact with people who have already rewritten your role in their story. That night, the couch became a kind of stage where I performed being small enough to fit into their world. I laid out the blanket she handed me, a thin, scratchy thing that smelled faintly of lavender and disuse, and I tried to find a position where my back didn't ache. Every time I shifted, the leather hissed under me, a sound that reminded me I didn't belong. The house was too quiet, that expensive kind of silence that comes from insulation and control. Even the baby's cries were muffled, as if edited out. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time my son had asked me how I was. Not the polite kind of asking, but the kind that waits for an answer. I couldn't. Somewhere between his promotions and her Pilates classes, I had become background noise, someone to manage, to thank perfunctorily, to keep invisible until needed for childcare or sentimental decoration. Around midnight, I heard them laughing softly upstairs. I turned my head toward the dark window. My reflection stared back at me, a face I almost didn't recognize, not because of the wrinkles, but because of the expression, obedient, apologetic, erased. I thought of my husband, Thomas, and how he used to say, "If you don't set your place at the table, someone will always hand you a smaller plate." I'd laughed then, thinking he was talking about dinner parties, not about life. But lying there, spine pressed against the seam of the couch, I understood exactly what he meant. I had been given the smallest plate in a feast I paid for. When I woke the next morning, my neck was stiff and my hands tingled from the cold. Lauren was already in the kitchen, humming, making avocado toast. She glanced up and smiled too widely. "Sleep okay?" she asked, the kind of question that requires a yes, not an answer. I said I had. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to her spotless counter. Ben came down with the baby, who looked beautiful and oblivious, wrapped in a soft blanket that probably cost more than the pension check I'd used to fix their roof last winter. He didn't look at me when he said good morning. He just handed me the baby and went to pour coffee, as if passing me a burden instead of his child. The baby's skin was warm against my arm. For a moment, I thought of how small Ben's hand had once been in mine, and I felt the kind of ache that has nothing to do with age. Breakfast was quiet, almost ceremonial. She fed him smoothie bowls and corrected how I held the baby. He scrolled through his phone and mentioned a dinner party that night. I wasn't invited, but they didn't need to say it. The omission was practiced. I asked about the house maintenance, the taxes, the insurance, little questions that mothers ask to feel useful. Ben brushed them off gently, like crumbs. "We've got it covered, Mom." I nodded. Of course they did. They always did, except when they didn't, except when they needed my name on a line. Later, while she took the baby upstairs for a nap, I wandered through the house quietly. The walls were white, the art abstract, the shelves filled with books arranged by color. Not a single photograph of Ben as a child, not one of me. I stopped at the top of the staircase and listened to the faint hum of a white noise machine in the nursery. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, everything was perfect. Matching linens, pale wood furniture, a faint scent of eucalyptus. It was beautiful, but it felt like a showroom, not a home. I stood there longer than I meant to, looking at the tiny knitted hat on the dresser, the one I'd made before the baby was born. Lauren had folded it neatly and tucked it behind a stack of designer swaddles, like a mistake she couldn't throw away, but didn't want seen. I went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, tracing the edge of a placemat with my finger. That's when I heard them talking upstairs, their voices muffled but clear enough through the vent above me. Her tone was sharp, brittle. "She can't keep staying here, Ben. It's too much. We need space. You said this would be temporary." A pause. Then his voice, quieter, uncertain. "She just helped with the mortgage. We can't just kick her out." She answered, almost laughing. "She'll get over it. She always does." And then the sound of a door closing. Something inside me shifted then. Not anger, not exactly, but a deep, slow recognition. I had spent my whole life getting over things so other people wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. I'd been the bridge, the cushion, the silent helper. But there comes a point when silence starts to rot inside you, when the kind smile and the gentle nod feel like shackles. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, only that I couldn't keep sleeping on that couch in a house with my name still on the deed. That evening, when they left for dinner, dressed in their expensive simplicity, I sat alone with the baby monitor blinking beside me. The light flickered softly, steady as a heartbeat, and I realized I hadn't heard my own in years, not the sound of it, but the pulse of my own will. I walked to my purse, pulled out the folder I always carried, and opened it. My name was still there in bold letters beside Ben's on the property deed. For the first time, I saw it not as proof of generosity, but as a lifeline. The house might not feel like mine anymore, but legally it still was. And if they thought I would fade quietly into that couch, they had mistaken the softness of age for the absence of resolve. I closed the folder and set it on the table, next to the tin of untouched shortbread. The living room lights dimmed automatically, programmed to save energy. I didn't move to turn them back up. In the half-dark, the reflection of the house glowed faintly in the window. Orderly, lifeless, perfect. I thought of my husband again, of his voice the day we signed our first mortgage papers 40 years ago. You never really own anything until you're willing to walk away from it. I used to think he meant risk, not freedom. But now, as I sat in that borrowed silence, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. Ownership is not about possession. It's about choice, and I was about to make mine. It happened the next morning, quietly, like most real betrayals do, not with shouting or accusation, but with the thin chill of certainty settling somewhere between my ribs. I had gone out early to buy croissants from the bakery down the street, thinking maybe, just maybe, a small kindness might loosen the frost that had formed overnight. The air was crisp, the kind that turns breath into fog and reminds you that you are still alive. When I came back, balancing the paper bag and a small bouquet of daisies I had picked up from the vendor by the corner, the front door was unlocked. Inside, I could hear voices, low, deliberate, intimate in that way people get when they are saying things they think you won't hear. I paused in the hallway, out of sight, the smell of coffee drifting toward me, mingling with the faint citrus of her cleaning spray. Lauren's voice first, sharp as glass wrapped in sugar. She can't stay forever, Ben. It's already weird. The neighbors ask questions. We have no space. Then his, tired, defensive. She just got here. It's only been a week. She laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that says patience is performance. A week turns into a month into a year. You know how she is. She'll never leave on her own. We have to decide. There was a pause, then the sound of ceramic on the counter, the clink of spoons. She's your mother, he said finally, but it didn't sound like conviction. It sounded like a reminder he wanted to forget. I stood there, fingers tightening around the paper bag until the grease from the croissants began to seep through. I could have walked in, pretended I hadn't heard, made some joke about breakfast, but something in me resisted the performance. I didn't move. I just listened as Lauren continued, her voice lower now, threaded with impatience. We can't keep living like this. It's supposed to be our home, our sanctuary. You promised we'd have privacy. What are we going to tell my parents when they visit? That your mother's camping on the sofa? He sighed. She helped us, Lauren. She paid the down payment. We can't just throw her out. She didn't hesitate, then buy her out. Those 3 words fell into the quiet like stones into deep water. I heard the splash, the ripples, the cold finality of it. Buy her out. As if I were some inconvenient tenant, a temporary arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. I set the bag on the side table by the stairs and turned toward the door before they could see me. The daisies trembled in my hand, petals brushing against my coat sleeve. I walked out into the cold again, not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed air that didn't smell like deceit. The morning light was thin and silver. Cars rolled past, windows fogged from the warmth of other people's lives. I walked without thinking, past manicured hedges and driveways lined with expensive cars, until I reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood. There, on a bench slick with dew, I sat down and opened my bag. The croissants were still warm, but I couldn't eat. I tore one in half, watching the steam curl up and disappear, and thought of all the meals I had cooked for Ben over the years, all the mornings I had woken early to make sure he had something fresh before school, the nights I'd stayed up late, waiting for him to come home safe. The idea that love could be measured, negotiated, or bought out felt absurd, but in that moment, absurdity and truth were indistinguishable. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough for the frost to melt, for a child's laughter to echo across the playground, for the smell of damp earth to replace the sweetness of pastry. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, but my mind was oddly clear. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it comes as understanding, and understanding can be the cruelest form of pain because it makes you complicit in your own neglect. I had allowed this. Piece by piece, I had surrendered ground under the banner of love until there was nowhere left for me to stand. I had made myself small, grateful, convenient, and they had learned to prefer me that way. When I returned to the house, the air felt different, as though it knew what I knew. Ben was in the living room, holding the baby. Lauren was upstairs, her voice faint through the ceiling, already on the phone, already making plans. I walked past him quietly, the smell of milk and baby powder following in my wake, and went straight to my purse on the sideboard. Inside was a manila envelope, the deed, the original one, the one I had never shown them because I trusted that honesty didn't need proof. My name was first, in bold letters, above his. It had been a simple legal arrangement at the time, but now it felt like something sacred, a small remnant of agency I hadn't realized I still possessed. I ran my finger along the edge of the paper, feeling the texture, the weight of ownership, the memory of signing it. Thomas had been gone 10 years by then, and I had used the money from selling our house, the house where Ben had grown up, to help him start over. I thought I was passing something forward, giving him the foundation I never had. But foundations can become prisons when the walls they support shut you out. I went to my room, or rather, the guest room that was no longer mine, and sat on the edge of the bed. The blanket was folded neatly, the kind of order that comes from wanting a space to look unoccupied. On the nightstand was a framed photo of Ben and Lauren at their wedding. I wasn't in it, though I had paid for half the reception. I looked at their smiling faces and tried to remember when he had stopped looking at me like that, with affection instead of duty. The answer hurt more than I expected. I thought of calling him upstairs, of confronting them both, of demanding acknowledgement, but confrontation only feeds people who thrive on control. Instead, I opened my phone and searched for a number I hadn't used in years, the real estate lawyer who had handled Thomas's estate. His name appeared, still stored under Mr. C, trustworthy. My finger hovered over the call button, but I didn't press it yet. That evening, when the house was quiet again, I went into the kitchen and began washing the few dishes in the sink. The act was mechanical, something to do with my hands while my thoughts organized themselves into something sharp and solid. Ben came in, loosening his tie, smelling faintly of cologne and exhaustion. "Mom," he said, careful, almost too careful. "We were talking this morning. Lauren thinks it might be easier for everyone if you stayed somewhere else for a while. Just until things settle down with the baby." He couldn't meet my eyes. I kept rinsing the glass in my hand, the water running warm over my fingers. "Somewhere else," I repeated quietly. He nodded, relieved by my calmness, mistaking it for consent. "Yes, maybe near Aunt Carol's, or a nice senior community. We'd help with the costs, of course. I turned off the faucet and set the glass upside down on the rack. The sound it made was small, but final. "You don't need to help with anything," I said. "You already have." He hesitated. "It's not like that, Mom. You know we love you." I smiled then, not because I believed him, but because I wanted him to hear how soft disbelief can sound when it's finally free of hope. "I know," I said, drying my hands. "You love me enough to want me somewhere else." He left the kitchen soon after, muttering something about not wanting to fight. I watched him go, his shoulders slightly hunched, the same way they used to when he was a boy caught doing something wrong, but not sorry enough to stop. Upstairs, Lauren's laughter floated down the stairs, bright and brittle. I wiped the counter, picked up my purse, and slipped the deed inside. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic music, just the quiet scrape of paper against fabric, the sound of resolve being folded into motion. I didn't have a plan yet, only a direction, and sometimes that's enough. That night, I lay again on the couch, but sleep didn't come. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked like a polite metronome. I stared into the dark, counting the seconds between each tick, and somewhere around the 1,000th one I decided. Tomorrow I would call the lawyer. Tomorrow I would walk into a place where my name still meant something. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would not explain. I would act. I thought of the daisies still on the table, their stems bent, petals beginning to curl inward, and I felt a surge of something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but a strange, fierce clarity. They thought they could buy me out, but you cannot buy out a woman who remembers every check she wrote, every bill she paid, every wall she painted, every night she prayed for the roof not to leak. I fell asleep just before dawn, a shallow, dreamless sleep that felt like holding my breath underwater. When I woke, the house was quiet, sun spilling through the blinds in thin golden bars. The deed was still in my bag, its corners pressing faintly through the fabric, a pulse of paper reminding me that I existed, not just as a mother, but as a person with the right to say no. Down the hall, I heard the baby cry and Lauren's soft cooing response, sweet, rehearsed. I sat up slowly, rubbed the stiffness from my neck, and whispered into the empty room, "No more couches." It wasn't a declaration. It was a promise, the kind that doesn't need witnesses because it's made to yourself. And that was the moment, the quiet, steady second when betrayal stopped being the story of what they had done to me and became the story of what I would do next. I began to understand the shape of my erasure in the small, daily rearrangements that look like kindness if you don't stare at them too long, and the house cooperated with the performance, each smooth surface and silent hinge reflecting back the same lesson. You are allowed when you are useful, and you are invisible when you are not. The morning after my decision that there would be no more couches soon, I found that the thermostat had been lowered to a crisp 48 overnight and locked behind an app I didn't have. And when I mentioned the chill casually, rolling my shoulders to unstick the ache that had settled there, Lauren smiled with the energetic brightness of someone selling a vitamin and said that cooler air was safer for the baby and better for sleep, and that if I felt cold, there was a basket of throws. By the media console, a basket of throws that looked like clouds and warmed like paper. And I said nothing because I had already learned that the statement, "I'm cold," in that house translated to, "I don't understand modern parenting." And it was. Always easier for them if I pretended to be warmed by their explanations. The baby gate appeared the same day, a gleaming white barricade across the hall that clicked with a magnetic certainty. and Lauren demonstrated its complicated release twice, not for my benefit so much as for the performance of responsible motherhood, and I nodded dutifully while noting that the gate also conveniently kept me from the only bathroom with a grab bar and a soft rug, funneling me instead toward the powder room off the kitchen where the mirror was too high and the light made my skin look like paper left in the rain. My mug disappeared, an ordinary blue ceramic I'd brought from my own kitchen because the lip fit my mouth just so, and in its place sat a novelty cup that read, "No Drama Nana," in jaunty letters, and Ben chuckled when he saw me holding it, a quick, embarrassed sound that asked me to play along, which I did, because there are wars you win by smiling while you count supply lines. And I had begun to count, copies, numbers, names. I took the deed to the copy center by the grocery store, the one with the disinterested clerk who always smelled like eucalyptus gum. And I fed the pages, all of them, even the ones most people never read, into the machine that breathed and hummed, like a friendly animal. And I watched my name bloom again and again in fresh toner, a repeated fact that steadied my hands. I bought a cheap folder in stubborn red and slipped the copies inside, then placed one set in the lining of my overnight bag, one behind the baking sheets at the back of the pantry where I knew Lauren never reached because cooking, for her, was choreography, not heat, and one into an envelope addressed to myself at my post office box, a rusty little door in a forgotten annex of the main branch that I had never closed because some part of me, even in the sweetest years of trust, had believed in keeping a key somewhere they couldn't find. On the way home, I stopped at the bank and asked to speak to a person at a desk, not the counter, and I requested paper statements for my savings account be resumed and mailed to the box. The young man in a narrow tie tried to steer me back toward the app, telling me how convenient it all was, how modern, and I smiled and said my eyes preferred real ink when it came to real money, and he hesitated as if I were asking for something indecent, then clicked the right boxes, the sound of tiny permissions. I withdrew a small amount in cash, nothing dramatic, just enough to fold into an old wallet and hide in the hem of my brown coat, because I am a woman of my mother's lessons, and money is not safety, but it is the key that opens the door to wherever safety might be hiding. Back at the house, I was greeted by the doorbell's cheerful chime and the eye of the new camera winking above the porch, a small black bead that felt like a pupil. And when I entered, Lauren greeted me with relief disguised as hospitality and told me how useful it was to be able to check deliveries from her phone, how it made everyone feel secure, and I imagined my silhouette captured in 100 small angles, archived somewhere, entering, exiting, lingering. Later, she texted a link to the household group thread, a list of shared expectations with emojis like sugar sprinkles, shoes off at all times, no heavy scents, no glass in the nursery, quiet hours after 9 because the baby's sleep schedule was delicate. And I wanted to reply that my life was delicate too and had been long before her calendar existed, but I merely typed, "of course," and watched the little heart reaction bloom next to my compliance. That afternoon, she suggested lightly that my old recipes were a bit rich for us right now, and maybe we could keep the kitchen on brand with anti-inflammatory choices. And when I reached for butter, she slid the ghee toward me with a smile that carried all the zeal of a convert, and I sautéed onions that refused to brown and remembered whole autumns fragrant with gravy and the kind of joy that leaves dishes to soak overnight without guilt. Ben began to talk to me in the efficient tone of workplace check-ins, asking if I was adjusting and if I had what I needed, and when I said I could use a lamp by the couch for reading because the overheads were surgical, he replied that the electricians would have to rewire a switch, and it was a whole thing. And maybe I could try the audiobook app he'd sent last year, and the conversation ended with us both feeling as if something had been accomplished, when in fact, something had been. Rubbed a little thinner. The neighbors began to appear with casseroles and compliments, and Lauren introduced me as a dear friend of the family who was visiting to help with the transition, and I watched the word friend float like a balloon and bump against the ceiling and stick there, helium, in a house that had no room for the weight of what I actually was. And when one woman with perfect hair and a laugh like wind chimes called me Mary, I didn't correct her because names carry power, and I was coiling mine back into my pocket for later. The mail brought a glossy brochure for a senior residence with photographs of happy people playing anemically colored bingo, and inside, someone had circled a unit that might be perfect if you ever wanted more independence, the irony of which nearly sent me to the floor with laughter that would have sounded like grief, and I set it under the dish of fruit that was too beautiful to eat, a paper coaster to protect the finish of a table I had helped pay for. The small tests multiplied. My coat relocated from the hall closet to a hook by the garage because it shed and looked heavy among the light seasonal jackets. My shoes placed on a mat by the back door with a little sign that said, outdoor only, as if I were a Labrador, a wicker basket labeled guest blankets that appeared beside the couch and made me think of lifeboats assigned to a single deck, a gentle suggestion that I leave the baby monitor on the console because the feed drained my phone, battery, and we're all sharing resources here, which sounded reasonable until I understood that what they were sharing was not resources, but control, one small handhold at a time. A friend of Lauren's from some wellness committee stopped by with almond flour muffins and an interest in my cognitive health, slipping the phrase into conversation like a merciful blade, and she asked casually if I ever lost track of dates or found myself misplacing items, and I told her that I misplaced trust, mostly, and the silence that followed was the most honest thing in the room. Later, I overheard the word assessment float down the stairs like a feather dipped in oil, and I followed it with my eyes and noted where it landed. At night, the couch taught my bones the dimensions of their patience. I learned to tuck the thin throw between shoulder blade and cushion seam, to angle my knee toward the armrest, to quiet the nerve that sang from hip to heel, to wake before anyone else, so I could fold the blanket and restore the room to the museum of itself, erasing the evidence of my sleep as if it were a stain. In the mornings, I made coffee quietly, holding the novelty mug at an angle so the slogan faced inward. And once, in an act of nostalgic rebellion, I buttered a slice of bread and sprinkled it with sugar the way my mother had done on nights when the budget ran out and when Lauren came in and sniffed the air like a sommelier of virtue and said, "That smells a bit old school." I smiled and said, "Yes, it's older than school," and ate the rest slowly, a sacrament of flour and defiance. Ben started leaving open tabs on the kitchen tablet, articles about filial responsibility and the stress of multi-generational households, an algorithm of justification, whispering that it was hard for them, that I should be grateful for any space at all, and somewhere between the second and third think piece, an ad blinked for a decluttering service that promised to edit your life. And I imagined what a ruthless editor would do with mine, and concluded that I preferred the long version. I tried to be useful the way they preferred, which is to say, invisibly, laundry folded and placed not in drawers, but on the end of beds like a hotel, the stroller's squeaky wheel oiled without mention, the stain on the nursery rug addressed with club, soda, and an old trick from my decades of saving what other people spilled. But usefulness, when it is unacknowledged, becomes a kind of ghost labor that haunts the very rooms it tidies. And I felt myself thinning in those hallways, a shadow that set the table and then stepped aside. On the third afternoon, I baked a simple chicken, the kind that perfumes a house with a memory of Sundays, and Lauren came home with a bag of takeout and the announcement that they were doing clean carbs tonight, and Ben apologized without meeting my eyes and said we would freeze my effort for later, a later that never arrived. And at midnight, when the refrigerator's blue light washed my hands in aquarium glow, I ate a wing cold and unrepentant over the sink, a queen reduced neither by throne nor audience. And yet, inside the quiet humiliations, the small teeth of a plan continued to set. I called Mr. C. and listened to his measured voice walk the perimeter of my situation. I asked him to confirm what my fingers already knew from the embossed certainty of the deed. I requested, politely and then firmly, a list of next steps that would be dull to most, ears and were music to mine: the title office hours, the affidavit template, the name of a notary who still believed in doorbells. I found the fireproof envelope where I had tucked Thomas's insurance papers and added my list, then slid the envelope under the mattress of the guest bed where the weight of my nightly compliance could keep it flat and accessible. I tested the bus route into town, pretending an errand for yarn, and noted the rhythm of stops, the faces of morning riders, the driver who greeted every passenger like a neighbor. I stood across the street from a squat building with a flag and a bronze plaque and read the words County Recorder 3 times until the gold letters felt like a password I could carry in my mouth. The worst of the escalation was not the chill or the camera or the gate. It was the way language withered. Lauren started to narrate me in front of others, a voiceover to my presence. She's so independent. She's very set in her ways. She forgets she's not in the 70s anymore. And each sentence cleared a little more land where my roots couldn't take. Ben adopted the gentle corrective tone of a tour guide ushering a foreigner past customs. Mom, we don't really do X anymore. Mom, the pediatrician says Y, as if the point of me were an outdated practice to be abolished. Even the baby began to mirror the house's preferences, turning his face toward the smooth voices and away from the one that had weight in it, which is to say mine. And although I knew better than to take it personally, some old salt in me stung. So I began to speak less, not as surrender but as storage, packing my voice carefully for the trip it would soon take, and in the spaces where words would have been, I counted again. Copies, addresses, the amount in my wallet, the hours, the title. Office opened, the number of steps from the bus stop to the recorder's door. The taste of my name when I said it without apology. On the 5th night, when the house had quieted to its curated hush and the refrigerator whispered to itself, I lay on the couch and felt the seam under my spine, the familiar line that had already marked me, and I knew that the escalation had done its work not by breaking me, but by making the alternative unmistakable. The couch taught certainty, the gate taught paths, the camera taught audience, the novelty mug taught farce, and my body, which has carried grief and groceries and a child and a marriage and a widowhood, understood a lesson older than this house and smarter than its lights. If they dim you long enough, you must build your own lamp. I closed my eyes and let the old blanket, a relic of my mother's hands I had pulled from a high shelf where Lauren had tucked it, because the pallet is cooler now, rest over my knees, and I threaded my fingers through the loose places where time had taught the fabric to forgive, and I whispered into its familiar weave a simple litany of instructions for the woman I still was. Wake before dawn, call the lawyer, take the bus, bring your name, bring your pen, bring the version of yourself that doesn't ask permission to breathe. The morning I finally moved was so ordinary it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the pulse in my wrist that told me the air itself had changed. I woke before the thermostat stirred, before the curated playlist of lullabies began its gentle tyranny upstairs, and I lay there for a moment under the thin throw, listening to the sigh of the refrigerator, the soft whir of the baby monitor, the small domestic hum of a house that believed itself content. The sky through the window was the color of pewter, a polite dawn, and I knew that if I stayed another day, my resolve would calcify into something harder to move than fear. I sat up slowly, joints whispering their familiar complaint, and looked around at the room that wasn't mine, the pristine shelves, the gleaming floors, the scent of lavender disinfectant that managed to smell like erasure. I folded the blanket precisely, as if I were leaving a hotel, and placed it at the end of the couch, aligning the corners because habit has a way of surviving even the death of affection. In the kitchen, I moved quietly, making a cup of coffee in my blue mug, the one I had hidden behind the juicer after finding it in the donation box weeks earlier. The first sip was bitter and strong and perfect. I stood there with my hands wrapped around the warmth, watching the light expand across the countertop, and I realized I was no longer waiting for their approval or permission. I was waiting for my own feet to move. I didn't pack much because a lifetime of caretaking teaches you how little you actually need. I filled my small overnight bag, the one that had sat in the corner of every house I'd ever visited, with the red folder, the deed copies, my medications, a photograph of Thomas smiling at a picnic table, and the recipe card in his handwriting for the lemon cake he used to call my peace offering. I took the old blanket from the top shelf of the closet, folded it twice, and strapped it to the handle. My purse held the cash from the bank, my ID, and a single envelope addressed to Ben in my neat, old-fashioned script. The letter inside said only, "The couch is all yours. The house was too, until it wasn't." I left it on the counter beside the cold coffee pot, a farewell without apology. Outside, the street was damp from last night's rain, the air smelling faintly of pine and wet asphalt. I walked down the driveway with steady steps, the wheels of my suitcase murmuring against the concrete, and for a moment I felt a peculiar weightlessness, as though gravity had loosened its claim. No one called after me. No one noticed. The bus stop was half a mile away, tucked beside a convenience store where I used to buy Ben ice cream bars after school. The clerk was new, young, with the distracted look of someone already elsewhere, and he didn't glance up as I changed a 5 into coins for the fare. The bus arrived exactly on time, an old diesel model that coughed like a smoker, and when the doors folded open, I felt the first real gust of freedom, a stale wind that still smelled better than any perfume of captivity. I sat by the window, the bag on my lap, and watched the neighborhood slide past. The identical houses with their ornamental wreaths, the careful landscaping, the polite emptiness. It struck me that every house looked like mine, and yet not one of them contained me. By the time we reached the courthouse district, the morning rush had thickened, and I stepped off into the gray crowd with the same deliberate calm I used to bring to operating rooms when I worked as a nurse decades ago, the calm of someone who understands that once the incision is made, the only way out is through. The title office was smaller than I remembered. The fluorescent lights a little harsher, the clerk older, his tie looser. When I handed him the documents, he squinted at the names, then at me. "You're Mrs. Harland?" he asked. "I was," I said. "Then I was Mrs. Harland and Associates, unofficially. Now I'm just Martha. It's simpler." He smiled uncertainly, stamped the papers with the slow gravity of bureaucracy, and slid them back across the counter with a nod that felt like recognition of some private courage he didn't need to name. Outside, the sky had cleared. The air smelled like possibility, sharp and raw. I walked to the small bank around the corner and asked to close my joint account with Ben, the one I had opened to help him manage the mortgage. The teller hesitated, saying she'd need both signatures, and I said sweetly that the mortgage was about to be managed by someone else. And she called the manager, and the manager called the lawyer, and within an hour, the transfer papers were drafted, stamped, witnessed. When the final signature dried, I felt the quiet thrill of a lock turning on the right side for once. It wasn't rebellion, not really. It was reclamation. I didn't storm or weep or even gloat. I simply acted the way you act when you've run out of justifications for other people's comfort. I called a realtor, the same woman who'd once helped Thomas and me find our first little house with the leaky porch, and she remembered my voice, or pretended to, which was kindness enough. "Of course, Martha," she said, "the market's good right now. I can have someone there by tomorrow." "Today," I said. "The sooner the better." She didn't argue. By late afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe across from the courthouse with a cup of tea that tasted faintly metallic and a paper bag of biscuits, and I watched the world move around me like a play I no longer had to perform in. I called Mr. C again and told him the listing was set, the deed confirmed, the signatures valid. He congratulated me in his dry, professional way and said, "You've done something most people only dream about, Mrs. Harland." "What's that?" I asked. Remembered you had a choice. By evening, I checked into a small motel on the edge of town, the kind with thin towels and thicker quiet. The clerk handed me the key card with a sympathetic smile that suggested she understood more than she said. The room smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness, but it was my loneliness now, not the one handed down by other people's decisions. I took a long shower, let the hot water beat against my shoulders until the ache softened, and then sat on the edge of the bed in the white light of the television I didn't turn on. I thought about calling Ben, about explaining, but explanations are gifts you owe only to those who listen the first time. Instead, I opened the window an inch and let the night air in. It was cold and smelled like rain on metal. I slept without dreams for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke before dawn again, habit refusing to leave me even in freedom. I made motel coffee, terrible and burnt, but it filled the room with the comforting smell of beginnings. I took out the red folder and spread the documents across the little desk, checking each signature, each seal. It was done, irreversible. The house would sell, the proceeds divided according to law, and I would take my half. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough for a small apartment, a new coat, maybe a garden if I found the right place. The thought made me smile, a small, private curve of the mouth that surprised me. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd smiled without worrying who might see. Around 8, I dressed in my best wool skirt and navy cardigan, the one Thomas used to call my good judgment outfit, and walked down to the diner next to the bus stop. The waitress called me Hun and poured coffee before I asked. She was probably 40, tired around the eyes but kind, and when she brought my eggs, she said, "You look like someone who's just done something brave." I laughed softly. "Something overdue," I said, and she nodded like she understood that those two things are often the same. I found a newspaper left behind on the counter and opened to the classifieds. The ink smelled familiar, earthy, like every job I'd ever taken to keep the lights on. One ad caught my eye: room for rent, quiet, no drama, cash only. I liked the bluntness of it. The address was a few blocks past the library. I finished my breakfast, left a good tip, and walked there, the wind tugging at the hem of my coat. The house was small and square, paint peeling, a cat dozing on the porch. When I knocked, a woman in her 70s opened the door, cigarette in one hand, suspicion in her eyes. "You Joyce?" I asked. "Who wants to know?" "Someone who needs a room and doesn't talk too much." She looked me up and down, then stepped aside. "Come in then. We'll see if we can tolerate each other." The room she showed me was narrow, but the window faced east, and sunlight spilled across the bedspread in a wide, forgiving stripe. I handed her the first week's rent in cash. She didn't count it, just pocketed it and said, "Kitchen shared, no perfume. Don't leave dishes in the sink." "I don't," I said. "Not anymore." By the time I unpacked my bag, the air in the room had changed. It smelled faintly of lavender and the faint metallic scent of my keys, the old ones, the ones that no longer fit anything. I laid them on the nightstand and realized I didn't need them anymore. The house they opened was no longer mine, but the life they had locked behind me was gone too. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt precise, like a note struck cleanly after too long out of tune. I sat on the bed and looked at the window, the street outside, the ordinary world still spinning, and I whispered a thank you to the version of myself who had finally stood up from the couch. When the realtor called that afternoon to confirm the listing, I listened to her talk about square footage and comparable sales, her voice bright and efficient, and I pictured the house, its sterile rooms, its curated peace, and I felt nothing but relief. "Price it to move," I said. "Someone else can polish the mirrors." When we hung up, I made a cup of instant coffee and stood by the window, watching the late sun filter through the branches. I thought of Ben and Lauren, of the look on their faces when they would find my note. The sudden scramble of panic disguised as concern, and I didn't feel satisfaction so much as release. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply done auditioning for love that had already turned its back. That evening, Joyce knocked on my door, holding 2 chipped mugs of tea. "You eat?" she asked. "Not yet." "Good. I made soup. Come down." The kitchen smelled of onions and something warm, and we ate without ceremony, the television murmuring in the background. She didn't ask where I'd come from or why my hands shook slightly when I lifted the spoon. She just refilled my cup and said, "Hate eating alone." I smiled. Me too. After she went to bed, I washed the dishes, dried them carefully, and set them in the rack. The cat jumped onto the counter and rubbed against my arm, purring. I whispered to him, "We made it," and his tail flicked like punctuation. When I finally lay down in the narrow bed, the sheets cool and clean, I listened to the house breathe. Pipes settling, floorboards creaking, the quiet sigh of another human moving in the next room, and for the first time in a long time, the sounds didn't make me tense. They were proof of life, not judgment. I closed my eyes and thought of the couch, the gate, the camera, the voices, all of it dissolving behind me, and I slept deeply, unguarded. In the morning, when sunlight spilled across the floor like a benediction, I sat up and smiled again, this time wide, unashamed. I had crossed the midpoint between endurance and agency, and there was no going back. It was almost 3 weeks after I left when Ben finally found me, though I had known from the moment the house went on the market that he would come looking, not out of remorse, not out of love, but out of the sudden panic of men who realized that the ground beneath their comfort was never theirs to begin with. I had spent those weeks quietly settling into my small room at Joyce's, finding a rhythm that belonged to no one but me. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, while the cat watched sparrows through the window, afternoons reading old novels from the library, evenings walking the length of the river path until the streetlights came on. My body was learning softness again, but a different kind than the one that had once meant submission. This was a softness of breath, of unguarded presence, of belonging nowhere, and therefore everywhere. The house sold faster than I expected. Joyce read the listing online one morning over toast and said, "Someone's desperate for square footage," and I smiled into my cup because desperation had finally changed hands. The sale closed within 10 days. I hadn't been back to the property, hadn't needed to. It lived behind my eyelids sometimes, but the image was fading. The day I received the official notice of the transfer, printed in neat black ink with my name beside the final amount, I felt something unclench between my ribs. I went to the bank, opened my own account, and deposited the check with hands that didn't shake. I bought myself a small gold ring from a thrift shop afterward, not for decoration, but as a private emblem of recovery, thin, plain, solid, and mine. The first phone call came that evening. I saw his name flash on the screen and let it ring until the silence returned. Then came another and another. Messages began to accumulate, each one angrier, shorter, more brittle. "Mom, what have you done? You didn't even talk to us. We could have worked something out." I didn't delete them, just turned off the sound. On the fourth day, he called from a different number, and out of some mixture of curiosity and old reflex, I answered. His voice was strained, halfway between pleading and accusation. "You sold it out from under us," he said. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I told him calmly that I had sold my property, my share, legally, properly, and that I hoped they found a new place that suited their style. There was a long pause, and then a sound that used to break me. His sigh, the same one he'd given as a child when disappointed. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "We would have made space. We were just figuring things out." I could almost hear Lauren in the background, whispering, coaching. "Space," I repeated. "That's exactly what I've done. I've made space." And before he could reply, I ended the call. The next day, a letter arrived at Joyce's addressed in Ben's handwriting. That looping, slightly uneven scrawl I'd once taught him to steady by tracing over grocery lists. Inside were photographs, the baby on the floor surrounded by toys, Lauren smiling, Ben holding up the sold sign in front of the house. On the back of the picture, a single line. "We thought you'd want to see what you've given up." I held it between my fingers for a long moment, then slid it into the drawer beside my bed. I didn't tear it, didn't burn it, just put it away, out of sight, but not denied. That night I walked farther than usual, following the river until the lights of town blurred into the distance. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel watched, didn't feel like an extra body in a room designed for someone else's comfort. I thought of Thomas and the way he used to say, "Freedom is quiet work, Mar," and I understood that what I was doing, this walking, this solitude, was exactly that. Quiet work. A week later, Lauren called. I recognized her voice instantly, the false brightness like glass ready to crack. "Martha, hi. We just wanted to talk, to clear the air. Things got a bit messy, but we can sort it out if you'll just meet with us." I listened to her sentences unwind, every one of them carefully balanced between manipulation and performance. When she mentioned the baby missing me, I almost laughed. "Lauren," I said when she finally paused for air, "I hope the baby sleeps well. That's all I have to say." She tried to pivot, to turn concern into control, but I hung up before the sentence ended. I imagined her holding the phone afterward, staring at it, unaccustomed to not having the last word. It must have unsettled her, the realization that politeness had ceased to be my weakness. But the calls didn't stop. They changed tone instead. First came the guilt, Ben's voice softer now, asking if I was lonely, if I missed the baby, if I was eating properly. Then the fear, Lauren's emails hinting that maybe the buyer wasn't stable, that maybe I'd been taken advantage of, that maybe the house would fall into ruin. Finally, the accusation, texts full of bitterness about family loyalty, about betrayal, about how you don't abandon blood. I read them all in the same chair by the window, tea cooling beside me, and each one sounded more like an echo fading into distance. They didn't realize that their words had lost their power because I no longer lived inside their story. One afternoon, Joyce found me at the kitchen table reading one of the letters. "Family?" she asked, lighting a cigarette despite the open window. "Former," I said. She blew out smoke, nodding. "They never like it when you stop being useful." I smiled. "No, they don't." She handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You're handling it better than most." I told her it wasn't handling, it was healing. She laughed, a low, raspy sound. "Same thing if you do it long enough." A few days later, Ben appeared at the door. I saw his car through the lace curtain before he knocked. The sight of it, clean, polished, expensive, was so out of place against Joyce's peeling paint and cluttered porch that for a moment I thought I was imagining it. He stood there in a dark coat, eyes shadowed, the set of his mouth too controlled. "Mom," he said, voice tight. "Can I come in?" Joyce, who had been watching from the living room, raised an eyebrow at me but said nothing. I nodded, stepping aside. He looked around the house, discomfort flickering in his expression, as if the air itself were too thick for him. "This isn't you," he said. "You don't belong here." I smiled, pouring him coffee into one of Joyce's chipped mugs. "I belong wherever I decide to sit." He didn't take the cup. "You've made everything so complicated," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Lauren's furious. We're scrambling for a new place. You could have just talked to us." "I did talk," I said. "You just weren't listening." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You sold the house for less than market value. You cheated yourself." "No," I said, leaning back. "I bought my piece at a discount." "That's a bargain." For the first time, he looked directly at me, really looked. "You've changed," he said, almost accusingly. I met his gaze, steady. "No, Ben, I stopped changing to fit your comfort." The silence that followed was thick, awkward, electric. Joyce coughed from the doorway, muttered something about needing more ashtrays, and disappeared upstairs. He tried again, lowering his tone. "We can fix this. Move in with us when we find the new house. We'll make space. Lauren, I interrupted, told me to sleep on the couch in the house I bought. There's no space large enough to make that small." His jaw tightened. "You're being spiteful." "No," I said gently. "I'm being awake." He didn't understand. He wasn't meant to. When he finally left, slamming the car door harder than necessary, I felt the tremor in my knees subside into something steadier. The second escalation, the pressure of their outrage, was proof of my distance. Their voices could reach my ears, but not my decisions. In the days that followed, I expected guilt to arrive like an old neighbor knocking, but it never did. Instead, I found myself noticing small, unexpected joys. The smell of wet soil after rain, the way Joyce hummed tunelessly while cooking, the cat curling on my lap without demand. I spent my mornings writing letters, not to Ben or Lauren, but to myself, small notes of record. You made coffee this morning without shaking. You read 3 pages of the book before thinking of them. You smiled at the woman in the market and didn't apologize for existing. I kept them in a jar on the nightstand, folded tight, a growing archive of quiet victories. But peace, as I learned, has its own tests. One evening, I found Ben waiting outside again, this time with Lauren beside him. She looked smaller than I remembered, eyes tired, voice brittle as she said, "We just came to understand. Maybe we can all sit down and find a way to move forward." I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. "There's nothing to move forward from," I said. "We're already where we're meant to be." "You can't just walk away from family," she said. "Watch me." Her mouth tightened. "You're being dramatic." "I learned from the best," I replied. Ben put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her. "Mom, please." The house was supposed to be for the baby. It was supposed to stay in the family. I felt a surprising calm wash over me. "Then you should have treated the family like it mattered." He started to speak again, but I raised a hand. "You wanted me quiet, contained, convenient. You got that for years. Now you want me generous again, but generosity without respect is servitude. I'm too old for that kind of labor." They left not long after, Lauren muttering something about ungratefulness, Ben looking back once before driving away. I watched the car disappear down the street, the red taillights shrinking into the distance, and I felt not sadness, but a deep settling stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you realize the worst has already happened, and you survived it. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with Joyce, the 2 of us drinking weak tea and watching moths throw themselves against the window. "You really sold it?" she asked suddenly. "Everything?" I nodded. "You ever going to tell them where you live?" "No," I said. "If they want to find me, they'll have to learn to look somewhere love lives." She nodded slowly. "That'll take them a while." We both laughed softly, the sound warm and worn. The next morning, a package arrived with no note, just a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a framed photo of the baby, alone, smiling, untainted by adult scripts. For a moment, my heart ached, not for what was lost, but for what might have been. I set the frame on the windowsill, where sunlight could touch it each morning. "You'll know your grandmother did one brave thing," I whispered. "That's enough inheritance for one lifetime." After that, I stopped expecting any more messages, and for a while, there weren't any. The silence that followed was rich, full, not absence, but space. I filled it with the steady noise of living, boiling rice, sweeping the porch, writing letters to friends I hadn't spoken to in decades. I joined a small group at the library for older women learning to use computers, and one afternoon, when the instructor asked us to write a sample email, I typed, "To myself." Subject, freedom. Message, "You did not escape, you arrived." Then I hit send. It was around that time that Joyce fell ill, a chest infection that lingered too long. I cooked for her, cleaned, reminded her of her own strength. "You're too kind," she croaked once, and I smiled. "No," I said, "just practiced." In caring for her, I found the kind of giving that doesn't cost selfhood. It was simple, balanced, human. When she recovered, she pressed a small key into my hand, the spare for the front door, and said, in case you ever need to come back. I laughed. I never left, I said, and she nodded, understanding. Then, one night, as spring thickened in the air, I sat by the open window, listening to the hum of the town, and realized that the story had shifted completely. I wasn't waiting to be found anymore. I wasn't rehearsing explanations or replaying hurts. I had become someone who didn't need a witness to feel real. The escalation had come and gone, and I was still here, breathing steadily in a room that belonged only to me. I looked at the baby's photo in the window light, at my reflection beside it, 2 lives separated by decades and choices, and I whispered, "You'll learn someday that love without respect is a slow death, and I hope you choose to live." The air was warm, the night wide, and I sat there until the horizon began to gray, not thinking of loss, not even of victory, but simply of the strange, ordinary miracle of surviving one's own silence and calling it freedom. The letter from the attorney arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked into a thin white envelope that looked too harmless to carry anything of consequence. I found it wedged among grocery flyers and utility bills on the small table by the door. Its return address stamped in the familiar serif font of the firm that had once handled our family's affairs. For a moment, I thought it might be a formality, perhaps a final confirmation of the sale, something perfunctory. But when I slid it open with the back of a butter knife and unfolded the pages, the air around me seemed to thicken. The language was courteous, distant, painfully professional. Ben and Lauren had filed a petition disputing the sale, claiming that I was no longer of sound capacity when I signed the papers, that undue influence might have been at play, that they were simply acting in my best interest. The words blurred together in their precision, and at the bottom, beneath the cold ink of a lawyer's signature, was the date of the hearing, 2 weeks from now. I stood there for a long moment, the kettle hissing softly on the stove behind me, and felt the old tremor of disbelief that used to visit me whenever someone I loved mistook my quiet for weakness. Then, as the steam began to rise and fill the kitchen, I realized that this was not shock. It was confirmation. They were still trying to own what they had already lost. I sat down at the small table, folded the letter neatly, and placed it beside the mug I'd been drinking from. The cat leapt onto the chair across from me, blinking with the indifferent calm of creatures who have never needed anyone's permission to exist. I envied that simplicity. But envy is a useless currency at my age, so instead I stood, poured the hot water over the tea leaves again, and began to think, not in the panicked, circular way of defense, but with the deliberate stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove. By the time Joyce shuffled in wearing her old robe, hair uncombed, I already knew what I was going to do. "Bad news?" she asked, pointing to the papers. "No," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Just an invitation to finish what I started." Over the next days, I gathered my records, receipts, statements, the unglamorous proofs of a lifetime spent paying attention. Every document I'd ever signed, every transfer, every repair bill, every email confirming a decision they had conveniently forgotten, I arranged in quiet order. I called Mr. C., who sounded both weary and impressed. "They're trying to reverse a legitimate sale, Martha," he said. "It won't stand, but it will take time." "Time I have," I told him, "and patience I've already paid for." He offered to represent me, but I declined. "You can file the response," I said, "but when the day comes, I'll speak for myself." There was a pause on the line, then a soft chuckle. "You always could," he said. When the hearing day arrived, the sky was a blunt gray, neither warm nor cold, the kind of weather that feels like waiting. Joyce insisted on coming with me, though she said little on the ride. She drove her old sedan with both hands gripping the wheel, muttering at stoplights. "You sure you don't want me to come in?" she asked as we pulled up in front of the courthouse. "No," I said, touching her arm. "I need to do this alone." She nodded, understanding. The courthouse steps were wide and clean, and as I climbed them, I felt the weight of every year settle on me, not as burden, but as armor. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of floor wax and bureaucracy. Ben was already there, standing with Lauren near the bench outside the chamber. He looked older than I remembered, pale, his tie slightly askew. She, on the other hand, was immaculate, every strand of hair in place, eyes sharp with the kind of conviction that feeds on self-righteousness. For a moment, our eyes met, and in hers, I saw no remorse, only fear disguised as moral superiority. "Mom," Ben started, stepping forward, but I raised a hand. "Don't," I said softly. "Save it for the judge." Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. The judge, a woman perhaps in her 50s, adjusted her glasses as we took our seats. My hands rested on the folder in my lap, its contents precise, calm. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice slick with practiced concern. He described me as a vulnerable senior, as though fragility were a disease I had chosen. He spoke of cognitive decline, of impulsive decisions, of emotional manipulation by unknown parties. At one point, Lauren dabbed her eyes theatrically with a tissue, and I nearly smiled at the performance. When he finally sat down, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Harland," she said, her tone neutral, "you may respond." I rose slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the act itself to carry weight. "Your Honor," I began, "I've been called many things in my life: mother, widow, nurse, volunteer, taxpayer. This is the first time I've been called incompetent. It's a peculiar experience to outlive your usefulness and then be told you must also outlive your mind." A faint murmur rippled through the small room, but I kept my gaze steady. I signed those papers because the house was mine to sell. I paid for it, maintained it, and gave it freely to people who mistook generosity for obligation. There was no manipulation, only realization that respect cannot be inherited. I could feel Lauren's stare burning into me, but I didn't look at her. They say I wasn't of sound capacity. Perhaps they're right in one sense. It took me 78 years to stop mistaking silence for peace. That kind of awakening can make anyone sound unfamiliar. The judge's mouth softened slightly, a flicker of empathy passing across her face. I opened the folder, slid the documents forward, the bank transfers, the repair receipts, the property tax statements, all in my name. "These are the facts," I said. "Everything else is theater." I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. The lawyer shuffled papers, whispering to Lauren, who whispered to Ben, who looked at the floor. The judge took her time reviewing the files, her pen tapping lightly against the desk. Finally, she looked up. "The sale stands," she said simply. "The court finds no evidence of incapacity or coercion. The petition is denied." Her gavel came down with a soft, definitive sound, like the closing of a door that had been left open too long. Lauren exhaled sharply, as if struck. Ben just sat there, stunned, his shoulders collapsing inward. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in defeating your own child. There was only the quiet, steady knowledge that dignity sometimes has to be defended in public, even from those who should have protected it privately. When the session ended, I gathered my papers, placed them back in the folder, and stood, Ben tried to speak again. "Mom, please, can we talk?" But the words hung between us like a language I no longer spoke. "There's nothing left to explain," I said. "You asked for the truth, and the court has given it. Learn to live with it." I turned and walked out. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Joyce was waiting in the car, smoking despite the window crack. "How'd it go?" she asked. I closed the door behind me, exhaled, and said, "It's over." She nodded, started the engine, and we drove in silence for a while before she said, "You don't look relieved." "I am," I said, "but relief isn't joy. It's just space." She nodded again, understanding. That evening, after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, the envelope of documents beside me. The clock ticked softly, the cat purred on the counter, and for the first time in months, my body felt light. Not young, never that again, but unburdened. I poured myself a small glass of the cheap wine Joyce kept for visitors and raised it quietly to the empty air. "To sound capacity," I whispered and drank. The room didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The silence was different now. It belonged to me. A few days later, a final letter arrived from the court, confirming the ruling. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in the back of a drawer. Then I went to the market, bought a small lemon tree, and planted it in a pot by the window. The leaves shone dark and clean in the afternoon sun. I watered it carefully, pressing the soil around its base. "Grow," I said softly, not as a command, but as permission. Outside, the sky was turning pink, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to look over my shoulder, no instinct to apologize for existing. The house was gone, the court was done, the past had spoken its last word, and I had spoken mine. What remained was the simplest thing of all: breath, warmth, and the faint promise of fruit. I didn't notice when summer arrived, only that one morning the air through the kitchen window smelled of rain on hot pavement, and the cat had stretched itself so long on the table that the tips of its paws trembled in sleep. The lemon tree by the window had grown 3 new leaves, each one glossier than the last, and when sunlight hit them just right, they cast tiny gold reflections on the wall, like coins tossed by invisible hands. I stood there for a long while, watching the light move, and realized that it had been months since I'd thought of the house. The court papers, the calls, even the faces that used to appear in my dreams had gone quiet. Sometimes I would wake and for a few seconds forget where I was, reaching instinctively for the couch blanket before remembering that I slept now in a real bed, under clean sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. Joyce snored down the hall, the clock ticked, the world kept its ordinary rhythm, and I found that peace was not a grand revelation, but a gradual softening of corners. I no longer expected apologies or reconciliation. What had been broken was not something that could be mended with words. It wasn't even hatred that had passed between us. It was a kind of blindness, a generational forgetting of what love owed to its elders. And perhaps blindness deserves no punishment beyond the simple fact of distance. Each morning I took to walking the same route through the park, past the benches where young mothers now sat scrolling their phones while toddlers chased pigeons. Sometimes one of the children would wave at me, and I would wave back, not out of longing, but of recognition. There was something universal about that small, unfiltered joy that needed no witness. On one of those mornings, I stopped at a cafe near the library, the kind with chipped mugs and polite servers who called everyone sweetheart. A woman about my age sat beside me at the counter, stirring sugar into her coffee with meticulous patience. She asked if I lived nearby, and when I said yes, she smiled. "I'm moving soon," she said. "My daughter thinks it's time for me to downsize." Says the stairs are too much for me now. I looked at her hands, still steady, her back straight, her eyes tired but bright. And do you agree with her? I asked. She hesitated, then laughed quietly. I don't know anymore. Maybe agreeing is easier than fighting. I thought of the couch, the gate, the camera, the mug that mocked me from its glossy surface. Easier, I said, but not better. She gave me a long, searching look, then nodded, as if she'd been waiting for someone to say it aloud. When we left, she touched my arm lightly and said, "You look like someone who knows how to begin again." It stayed with me the rest of the day, that sentence, not because it flattered me, but because it felt true. At home that evening, I opened my jar of letters, the small slips of paper I had written to myself in the early days after leaving. There were dozens now, each one folded neatly, some yellowed at the edges from the heat of summer. I unfolded a few at random. You made coffee and didn't tremble. You said no without explanation. You walked without looking back. The handwriting was uneven, shaky at first, then steadier with each note. I read them slowly, tracing the ink with my finger, until the cat jumped into my lap and scattered them across the table like leaves. For a moment, the air shimmered with all those small affirmations of survival, and I realized that every act of defiance had been, in truth, a form of love, the kind of love women give themselves when no one else remembers to. A week later, Ben called again. His voice was tentative, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Mom," he said, "we moved into the new place. Smaller, but nice. The baby's walking now. He keeps pointing at things and saying, 'Up.'" I listened, letting the words settle without reaction. Then he said, "I'm sorry for how it all went." I didn't see things clearly. I almost told him that clarity comes only after blindness has run its course, but instead I said, "I hope your son never feels small in his own house." He was silent for a moment, then whispered, "Neither do I." There was a pause, the sound of his breath on the line, then a quiet, "Take care, Mom." When the call ended, I didn't cry. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a gift you give others. It's the permission you give yourself to stop rehearsing pain. I had already done that work. His apology was an echo reaching a shore that no longer needed it. Time began to pass differently after that. Joyce's health improved, and sometimes we'd sit on the porch together in the evenings, drinking tea from mismatched cups, trading fragments of our histories like postcards from faraway places. She'd talk about her late husband, about the years she spent working at a factory that doesn't exist anymore, about the silence of an empty house before I moved in. "It's funny," she said once, "how people think growing old means disappearing." I smiled. Maybe that's because they can't imagine a life that isn't orbiting them. She laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh, and said, "Well, let's keep confusing them then." And so we did, two women out of sync with expectation, living on our own terms in a way, small, imperfect house filled with the scent of tea, smoke, and lemon leaves. Some nights I still dream of the couch, not as a place of humiliation anymore, but as a relic, a stage where the final act of my old self was performed before the curtain fell. In the dream, I stand beside it looking down, and I see not defeat, but a body that decided to rise. The woman lying there is no longer me. She's a ghost of duty, of silence, of all the ways I used to make myself smaller so others could shine. I watch her vanish with the morning light and wake with the taste of freedom on my tongue. The body remembers the difference between endurance and peace, and mine has finally learned which one to choose. When I walk through the market now, I see women of my age everywhere, pushing carts, counting change, wearing the kind of tired grace that goes uncelebrated. Sometimes one of them catches my eye, and there's a moment of recognition, a flicker that says, I know what you've survived. To them, I would say this, if I could, do not mistake comfort for safety. Do not call it love when they shrink you to fit their plans. You are allowed to take back the room they have built around your silence. You are allowed to sell the house, to walk away, to begin again. One afternoon in late August, I sat by the window with the cat asleep on my lap and wrote my last note for the jar. The paper was soft from the humidity, and my pen hesitated only once before moving. You kept your promise. You got up from the couch. I folded it and dropped it into the jar, listening to the faint rustle as it joined the others. Outside, children were shouting, the kind of laughter that ripples without reason. The lemon tree shimmered in the heat, its leaves casting moving shadows across the floor. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the warmth settle into my bones. The world had not changed, not really, but I had, and that was enough. For the first time in a long life spent trying to belong, I was exactly where I needed to be. Not a guest, not a burden, not a mother performing usefulness, but simply a woman who had chosen her own quiet and found that it was vast. And if I could leave one message behind for any woman sitting tonight on a couch in a house she paid for, it would be this. You are not furniture. You are the foundation. And the moment you remember that, the walls will no longer hold you.